In Denmark, Christmas dinner is a sacred event. Families gather, traditions are honored, and every single detail, from the decorations to the food, has meaning. But there's one rule everyone knows. Always set the table for an even number of guests, never 13. 13 is unlucky. If you have 13 guests, an old superstition says someone at that table will die before the year is out. Most people dismiss it as a silly old tale. But some families know better. This is the story of the Hansen family, their perfect Christmas dinner, and the uninvited 13th guest who taught them that some traditions are there for a reason. The Hansen family was the definition of success. Old money, living in a restored manor house just outside Copenhagen, their lives were built on tradition and pride. Every Christmas, the matriarch, Birgitte Hansen, hosted a formal dinner for extended family and important friends. Everything had to be perfect. This year, she had planned meticulously. 12 guests. The perfect, safe number. The invitations were sent months ago. Everything was confirmed. Christmas Eve arrived. The house was a masterpiece of festive elegance. The table set with the finest china. The guests began to arrive, Henrik and his wife, Sophie and her husband, the cousins, the business partners. Everyone who mattered was there. Then, at 7 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. The butler answered to find a small, hunched old woman standing in the snow. She wore old-fashioned clothes and carried no coat or bag. She just stood there, smiling, and said she was there for dinner. The butler was confused. This woman wasn't on the list. He tried to explain the mistake, but Birgitte had overheard. She came to the door, and while she didn't recognize the woman, she felt a strange pull, a sense that turning her away would be a terrible mistake. So she invited the woman in. The old woman said she'd been called many things, but Birgitte could call her Edith. Birgitte was flustered. They now had 13 guests. The unlucky number. But what could she do? It was Christmas Eve. She told the butler to set another place. He looked worried, reminding her of the superstition, but Birgitte waved it away. "It's just folklore," she insisted. "We're modern people." The table was reset for 13. As the guests took their seats, they whispered amongst themselves. Who was this old woman? No one knew, but Birgitte insisted she was a welcome guest. Dinner began. The food was exquisite, the conversation polite, but there was a strange tension in the air. The old woman, Edith, sat quietly at the end of the table, her sharp eyes watching everyone. Then she started to speak. She made small observations, dropping them casually into the conversation. But these weren't just observations. They were secrets. Henrik's affair, Sophie's embezzlement from our own company, a cousin's hidden addiction, a business partner's fraud. Each comment landed like a small bomb, making the guests squirm in their seats. This old woman knew everything. Birgitte tried to regain control, politely asking Edith to stop. This was Christmas, a time for kindness. Edith just smiled and said Christmas was also a time for truth, for judgment. She explained she was there to help, to show them the truth of their lives, to give them a chance to change before it was too late. The guests fell silent, a cold dread creeping into the elegant dining room. They had invited something dangerous into their home, something that saw right through them. As the main course was served, Edith began to tell stories, one for each guest. Not gossip, but the deep, unvarnished truth. She spoke of how Henrik's affair was destroying his family. She detailed how Sophie's greed was hurting innocent employees. She calmly laid bare the cousin's lies and the business partner's deception. The guests tried to deny it, to make excuses, but Edith knew too many details. Eventually, they sat in ashamed silence, exposed and waiting. Then, Edith gave them a choice. They could continue down their current paths, keeping their secrets. If they did, She described the specific, severe consequences each of them would face. Or they could change, make amends, fix what they had broken. If they chose this path and were sincere, the consequences would be avoided. The choice was theirs, but they had to decide before midnight. The guests were terrified. Who was this woman? How did she have this authority? Birgitta finally demanded to know who Edith really was. The old woman stood up, and as she did, she seemed to transform. Her hunched form straightened, her wrinkled face became ageless, and her simple clothes shimmered with an otherworldly light. She was no longer just an old woman. She was something ancient and powerful. "I am a Norn," she declared, "one of the weavers of fate." She had been watching the Hansen family, had seen their sins accumulate, and had decided to intervene. Panic erupted. Some guests tried to flee, but the doors were locked, the windows sealed. They were trapped. The Norn told them they had 2 hours until midnight to make their choice. One by one, the guests broke. Henrik confessed to his wife, begging for forgiveness. Sophie called her company, admitting her theft and promising to return the money. The cousin admitted his addiction and asked for help. Most of them chose honesty, chose to face the consequences and try to be better. But a few refused. They insisted they'd done nothing wrong, blaming others for their own failings. They sat in defiant silence, sealing their own fates. As midnight struck, the Norn nodded. She told those who had chosen to change that they would be given their chance. But she warned that if they failed to follow through, the consequences would return doubled. To those who refused, she said their fates were sealed. Within the year, judgment would find them. Exactly at midnight, the doors unlocked and the Norn vanished. The guests who had refused to change fled into the night. The others remained, supporting each other, committed to their new promises. Birgitta finally understood. The 13th guest hadn't brought death. She had brought truth. The old superstition was right, but not in the way people thought. 13 guests wasn't dangerous because someone would die. It was dangerous because secrets would be revealed. The 13th guest was always judgment. The Hansen family Christmas was never the same. Their dinners became smaller, more honest affairs. They never had 13 guests again, and they watched as, within the year, the Norn's judgment came for those who had refused to change. The fraudster was arrested. The cruel one faced social ruin. The arrogant one lost everything. The Norn's judgment was perfect and inevitable. Years later, Birgitta would tell her grandchildren the story. They'd ask if it was real, and she'd say, "Absolutely. The Norns are always watching, always weaving." Most people don't get a personal visit from fate, a clear warning. The Hansen family did, and most of them took the chance they were given. In Denmark, families still avoid setting the table for 13. Most think it's just a silly superstition. But some know better. They know that number can invite a special kind of guest, the one who knows your secrets. And if you're lucky, she'll give you a choice before midnight, a chance to change. Because some of the greatest gifts come wrapped in judgment, and sometimes the guest you never wanted is the one you needed most. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from the edge of folklore in the dark north.